All right, so today we're diving into something that feels kind of like watching one of those reality shows, where the alliances are always shifting and there's always some crazy twist coming around the corner.
You mean where you can never really tell who's about to get voted off the island?
Yeah, exactly. And in this case, the big plot twist is that the U.S. seems to be changing its whole stance on the Ukraine conflict. It's kind of a big deal, and no one's quite sure what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to watch, even with everything else going on in the world right now. Like the Middle East, which is always a bit of a powder keg, and you've got the whole US-China rivalry heating up in the Pacific. There's never a dull moment in international relations.
Never a dull moment, that's for sure.
But Ukraine just keeps pulling focus, doesn't it?
It does. And for good reason, I think, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you have Russia, which is a nuclear power directly involved. You have NATO on edge. And then, of course, the human cost for the Ukrainian people is just enormous. So it's not something we can just ignore.
Absolutely. And the implications of this conflict are absolutely massive for global security. We're talking about a potential reshaping of the world order here.
Exactly. And it's not just a flash in the pan either. I mean, we're talking 3 years now that this has been going on. So for this deep dive, we really want to go beyond just the headlines. We want to understand what's really driving these changes in U.S. policy. We're going to try to figure out what it means for Europe. And we'll try to make sense of the big picture for all of us, really.
Sounds good.
So maybe the biggest change is the U.S. position on whether Ukraine should join NATO.
Right.
For a long time, it seemed like the U.S. was all for it, open door policy and all that. But now,
Well, it seems like a big nope, doesn't it? I mean,
yeah,
the new U.S. Defense Secretary has pretty much said Ukraine's not getting in anytime soon.
it's almost like they completely flipped the script. What do you think's behind such a, well, drastic shift?
Well, it seems pretty clear that the U.S. is trying to dial down the tension with Russia. I mean, Moscow has always seen NATO expansion, especially into Ukraine, as a huge threat. It's like their biggest red line. So by taking NATO membership off the table, the U.S. is basically trying to appease Russia, hoping to avoid things escalating even further.
Right. So basically removing a major point of friction. But does that really solve the problem? I mean, like magically make everything better? It seems like there's still a whole lot of other stuff that needs to be sorted out.
Yeah, it's definitely not a magic bullet, that's for sure. The NATO issue was a big deal, but even if that's settled, you still have these huge territorial disputes that are just, well, really hard to resolve. And then there are all the underlying security concerns that both Ukraine and Russia have. And frankly, neither side seems willing to budge on their core demands. So, yeah, it's not a quick fix. It's more like, if you and I were arguing about what to have for dinner, taking one dish off the menu doesn't mean we're suddenly going to agree on everything else.
Makes sense. And, speaking of things that are hard to agree on, let's talk about the whole territory issue. That seems like it could be the real deal breaker for any lasting peace, don't you think?
For sure. The territorial disputes are at the core of this whole mess, and they're creating these massive legal and political roadblocks that seem almost impossible to get around. We're talking about Russia taking Crimea back in 2014 and then trying to do the same thing with four more regions in 2022: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson. Now, the thing is, most countries don't consider these annexations legal.
And Ukraine's own constitution doesn't even allow them to just give up these territories, right?
Exactly. Any Ukrainian leader who agreed to hand over those regions would basically be breaking their own laws. It's just not politically feasible. And then on the other side, you have Russia holding these so-called referendums in those areas to try to make it look like the people there want to join Russia. But the rest of the world pretty much saw those as a sham. They were organized under military occupation, so, how free and fair could they really be?
Crimea is a particularly tough one, isn't it? It's been under Russia's control for a decade now after that initial referendum. It's almost like a whole different reality there now with different laws and everything.
Yeah, Crimea really shows how complicated these territorial grabs can get. Russia's been treating it as part of their country for so long that it's created this really entrenched situation, even though most of the world doesn't recognize it. And it's not just about legal technicalities either. Think about the millions of Ukrainians who are living in these occupied areas. Their lives have been completely upended. They've got new laws. They're using a different currency. They're under a whole new administration. And all of this is happening while the fighting to retake these areas continues. It's just tragic.
It really is. And now, on top of all that, it looks like the U.S. is changing its approach to providing aid to Ukraine. It seems like they're sending a pretty clear message to Europe.
Yeah, you could say that. The U.S. has basically hit the pause button on giving Ukraine more military aid. They're saying is because Zelensky isn't doing enough to push for peace talks, which is interesting because over $1 billion in aid is on hold right now. What do you think's the real message behind this move?
Well, it's definitely more than just a little tap on the shoulder. I think it's a pretty big shift in strategy.
It is. And while some of that aid might eventually make its way to Ukraine, this move needs to be seen as part of a bigger picture. The U.S. is basically saying to Europe, hey, we've been the main security provider around here for a long time, and now it's your turn to step up. I mean, think about it. Europe has relied on the U.S. for military and financial support for decades.
It's almost like the U.S. is saying, look, we're not cutting you off, but we're definitely changing the terms of the deal.
Exactly. The U.S. wants Europe to take on more responsibility for its own defense, and this aid pause is a pretty dramatic way to make that point. Now, whether it'll actually work in the long run, well, that's another story. It's a big gamble, for sure.
So how's Europe taking all this? Are they freaking out? Are they annoyed? What's the mood over there?
You know, it's interesting. It doesn't seem like there's widespread panic in Europe. Instead, what we're seeing is a real push to beef up European defense. A lot of key countries are starting to take this seriously.
Like who? What kind of things are they actually doing?
Well, Germany, for instance, is putting a lot more money into its military. They've announced some pretty big increases in their defense budget. And France, which has always had a pretty strong military in Europe, they're actually thinking about extending their nuclear deterrent to cover some of their allies, like Poland and the Baltic states.
Wow, okay. That would be a pretty big change.
It would.
Hmm.
It shows that they're willing to take on a bigger role in keeping the region safe. And then at the European Union level, the European Commission has come up with this huge plan to modernize their militaries.
Hmm.
We're talking about potentially 800 billion euros. That's a serious commitment if they actually follow through.
It sounds like the U.S. might finally be getting what it's been asking for. I mean, they've been nagging Europe to spend more on defense for years.
You're absolutely right. The U.S. has been pushing Europe to do this for ages. And it seems like the situation with Ukraine and the shifting U.S. role has really lit a fire under them. If they actually manage to pull this off, it could seriously change the balance of power in Europe. It's potentially a whole new era.
But Europe isn't exactly a monolith, is it? I mean, there have got to be different opinions on how to handle all of this.
Yeah. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of different perspectives in Europe about what the best way forward is. Some countries still want to stay close to the U.S. for security, while others want to see Europe become more independent and capable of handling its own affairs. And to be honest, there's no guarantee that the EU's grand plan for defense will actually succeed. There are a lot of hurdles to overcome. It'll take a lot of political will. They'll have to agree on what their priorities are, and everyone will have to chip in the money and resources to make it happen. So yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty about what the future holds for European defense.
Okay. So, big picture, where does all of this leave us? The U.S. seems to be changing its approach to NATO and Ukraine. Europe is starting to take its own defense more seriously. And Russia is continuing to do its thing. Where do we go from here?
Well, the one thing that's clear is that there's a lot of uncertainty and mistrust floating around between everyone involved. And that's not a great foundation for building peace, is it?
Not really.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for the chances of actually ending the war in Ukraine? Are we any closer to a resolution?
Well, looking at how these kinds of conflicts usually play out, and based on what we're seeing on the ground right now, I think it's fair to say that a lasting peace in Ukraine still seems pretty far off. While changes in international policy can definitely shake things up and create opportunities for negotiation, the core issues that started this whole thing, those are still there. You've got the territorial disputes that no one wants to back down from. You've got legitimate security concerns on all sides, and you've got deeply entrenched political positions that are really hard to shift. And historically speaking, ceasefires in these kinds of situations tend to be pretty fragile. So yeah, the road to peace is likely going to be a long and bumpy one.
Okay, so for you listening, the main takeaway here is that the U.S. is seriously changing how it's involved in the Ukraine conflict. And that means Europe is under a lot of pressure to figure out how to keep itself safe. It's a real turning point for European security.
Absolutely. What we're witnessing is a huge turning point. The old system of security in Europe, which has been in place for decades, is being challenged and is changing right in front of us. And the decisions that the US and Europe make in the next few years are going to have a massive impact, not just for Europe itself, but for the whole world. This is about more than just Ukraine. This is about the future of global geopolitics.
So as we wrap things up, here's something to think about. Given everything we've talked about today, with the U.S. changing its strategy and Europe trying to become more self-sufficient in defense, what do you think are the most likely scenarios for the future of European security? How do you see the conflict in Ukraine finally ending? And what could happen that might throw everything we think we know right out the window? Maybe some big political shakeup, or some unexpected economic crisis, or some other global event that no one's even thinking about yet. The world is full of surprises, and this story is far from over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been, well, let's just say, it's been interesting to try to make sense of it all.
That's for sure.
Until next time.
See ya.